Venetians could stride through their city without having to squeeze past dense clusters of slow-moving tourists. The city breathed. Its pulse quickened. Venetians had Venice all to themselves. But the atmosphere was subdued. People spoke in hushed, dazed tones of the sort one hears when there has been a sudden death in the family. The subject was on everyone's lips. Within days I had heard about it in such detail, I felt as if I had been there myself. It happened on Monday evening, January 29, 1996. Shortly before 9 o'clock, Archimedes Seguzzo sat down at the dinner table and unfolded his napkin. Before joining him, his wife went into the living room to lower the curtains, which was her long-standing evening ritual. Signora Seguzzo knew very well that no one could see in through the windows, but it was her way of enfolding her family in a domestic embrace. The Seguzzos lived on the third floor of Ca' Cappello, a 16th-century house in the heart of Venice. A narrow canal wrapped around two sides of the building before flowing into the Grand Canal a short distance away. Signor Seguzzo waited patiently at the table. He was 86, tall, thin, his posture still erect. A fringe of wispy white hair and flaring eyebrows gave him the look of a kindly sorcerer. He had sparkling eyes that captivated everyone who met him. If you happened to be in his presence for any length of time, however, your eye would eventually be drawn to his hands. They were large, muscular hands, the hands of an artisan whose work demanded physical strength. For 75 years, Signor Seguzzo had stood in front of a blazing hot glassworks furnace, 10, 12, 18 hours a day, holding a heavy steel pipe in his hands, turning it to prevent the dollop of molten glass at the other end from drooping to one side or the other, pausing to blow into it to inflate the glass, then laying it across his workbench, still turning it with his left hand, while, with a pair of tongs in his right hand, pulling, pinching, and coaxing the glass into the shape of graceful vases, bowls, and goblets. After all those years of turning the steel pipe hour after hour, Signor Seguzzo's left hand had molded itself around the pipe until it became permanently cupped, as if the pipe were always in it. His cupped hand was the proud mark of his craft, and this was why the artist who painted his portrait some years ago had taken particular care to show the curve in his left hand. Men in the Seguzzo family had been glassmakers since the 14th century. Archimedes was the 21st generation and one of the greatest of them all. He could sculpt heavy pieces out of solid glass and blow vases so thin and fragile they could barely be touched. He was the first glassmaker ever to see his work honored with an exhibition in the Doge's Palace in St. Mark's Square. Tiffany sold his pieces in its Fifth Avenue store. Archimedes Seguzzo had been making glass since the age of 11, and by the time he was 20, he had earned the nickname Mago del Fuoco, Wizard of Fire. He no longer had the stamina to stand in front of a hot and howling furnace 18 hours a day, but he worked every day nonetheless, and with undiminished pleasure. On this particular day, in fact, he had risen at his usual hour of 4:30 a.m., convinced as always that the pieces he was about to make would be more beautiful than any he had ever made before. In the living room, Signora Seguzzo paused to look out the window before lowering the curtain. She noticed that the air had become hazy, and she mused aloud that a winter fog had set in. In response, Signor Seguzzo remarked from the other room that it must have come in very quickly, because he had seen the quarter moon and clear sky only a few minutes before. The living room window looked across a small canal at the back of the Fenice Opera House, 30 feet away. Rising above it in the distance, some 100 yards away, the theater's grand entrance wing appeared to be shrouded in mist. Just as she started to lower the curtain, Signora Seguzzo saw a flash. She thought it was lightning. Then she saw another flash, and this time she knew it was fire. "Papa," she cried out, "the Fenice's on fire!" Signor Seguzzo came quickly to the window. More flames flickered at the front of the theater, illuminating what Signora Seguzzo had thought was mist, but had in fact been smoke. She rushed to the telephone and dialed 115 for the fire brigade. Signor Seguzzo went into his bedroom and stood at the corner window, which was even closer to the Fenice than the living room window. Between the fire and the Seguzzo's house lay a jumble of buildings that constituted the Fenice. The part on fire was farthest away, the chaste neoclassical entrance wing with its formal reception rooms, known collectively as the Apollonian rooms. Then came the main body of the theater with its elaborately rococo auditorium, and finally the vast backstage area. Flaring out from both sides of the auditorium and the backstage were clusters of smaller, interconnected buildings like the one that housed the scenery workshop immediately across the narrow canal from Signor Seguzzo. Signora Seguzzo could not get through to the fire brigade, so she dialed 112 for the police. The enormity of what was happening outside his window stunned Signor Seguzzo. The Gran Teatro La Fenice was one of the splendors of Venice. It was arguably the most beautiful opera house in the world, and one of the most significant. The Fenice had commissioned dozens of operas that had premiered on its stage: Verdi's La Traviata and Rigoletto, Igor Stravinsky's The Rake's Progress, Benjamin Britten's The Turn of the Screw. For 200 years, audiences had delighted in the sumptuous clarity of the Fenice's acoustics, the magnificence of its 5 tiers of gilt-encrusted boxes, and the Baroque fantasy of it all. Signor and Signora Seguzzo had always taken a box for the season, and over the years they had been given increasingly desirable locations until they finally found themselves next to the royal box. Signora Seguzzo had no luck getting through to the police either, and now she was becoming frantic. She crawled upstairs to the apartment where her son Gino lived with his wife and their son Antonio. Gino was still out at the Seguzzo glass factory in Murano. Antonio was visiting a friend near the Rialto. Signor Seguzzo stood silently at his bedroom window, watching as the flames raced across the entire top floor of the entrance wing. He knew that, for all its storied loveliness, the Fenice was at this moment an enormous pile of exquisite kindling. Inside a thick shell of Istrian stone lined with brick, the structure was made entirely of wood, wooden beams, wooden floors, wooden walls, richly embellished with wood carvings, sculpted stucco, and papier-mâché, all of it covered with layer upon layer of lacquer and gilt. Signor Seguzzo was aware, too, that the scenery workshop just across the canal from his house was stocked with solvents, and, most worrisome of all, cylinders of propane gas that were used for welding and soldering. Signora Seguzzo came back into the room to say she had finally spoken with the police. "They already knew about the fire," she said. "They told me we should leave the house at once." She looked over her husband's shoulder and stifled a scream. The flames were now advancing through the 4 smaller reception halls toward the main body of the theater, in their direction. Archimedes Seguzzo stared into the fire with an appraising eye. The wind was blowing toward the southwest. The Seguzzos were due west of the theater, however, and Signor Seguzzo calculated that if the wind did not change direction or pick up strength, the fire would advance toward the other side of the Fenice rather than in their direction. "Now, Nandina," he said softly, "stay calm. We're not in any danger." The Seguzzos' house was only one of many buildings close to the Fenice. Except for Campo San Fantine, a small plaza at the front of the theater, the Fenice was hemmed in by old and equally flammable buildings, many of them attached to it or separated from it by only 4 or 5 feet. This was not at all unusual in Venice, where building space had always been at a premium. Seen from above, Venice resembled a jigsaw puzzle of terracotta rooftops. Passages between some of the buildings were so narrow one could not walk through them with an open umbrella. It had become a specialty of Venetian burglars to escape from the scene of a crime by leaping from roof to roof. If the fire in the Fenice were able to make the same sort of leap, it would almost certainly destroy a sizable swath of Venice. The Fenice itself was dark. It had been closed 5 months for renovations and was due to reopen in a month. The canal along its rear facade was also closed, empty, having been sealed off and drained so work crews could dredge the silt and sludge from it and repair its walls for the first time in 40 years. The canal between the Seguzzos' building and the back of the Fenice was now a deep, muddy gulch with a tangle of exposed pipes and a few pieces of heavy machinery sitting in puddles at the bottom. The empty canal would make it impossible for fireboats to reach the Fenice, and, worse than that, it would deprive them of a source of water. Venetian firemen depended on water pumped directly from canals to put out fires. The city had no system of fire hydrants. The Fenice was now ringed by a tumult of shouts and running footsteps. Tenants, routed from their houses by the police, crossed paths with patrons coming out of the Ristorante Antico Martini. A dozen bewildered guests rolled suitcases out of the Hotel La Fenice, asking directions to the Hotel Saturnia, where they'd been told to go. 2 fireboats managed to navigate to a water-filled canal a short distance from the Fenice. Their hoses were not long enough to reach around the intervening buildings, however, so the firemen dragged them through the kitchen window at the back of the Antico Martini and out through the dining room into Campo San Fantine. They aimed their nozzles at flames burning furiously in a top-floor window of the theater, but the water pressure was too low. The arc of water barely reached the windowsill. Several policemen struggled with the massive front door of the Fenice, but to no avail. One of them drew his pistol and fired 3 shots at the lock. The door opened. 2 firemen rushed in and disappeared into a dense white wall of smoke. Moments later, they came running out. "It's too late," said one. "It's burning like straw." The wail of sirens now filled the air. as police and firemen raced up and down the Grand Canal in motor